Thank you. So, can everyone hear me loud and clear? How many of you people were in the last session? Oh, wow, I didn't scare you all off then. Oh, that's fantastic. And how many people obviously weren't in the last session? Excellent, okay. Well, my name's Andy Budd, and as you can probably tell, I'm not from the States. I'm from a little small town called Brighton in England, which is down on the south coast. I run a small web development team down there called ClearLeft. We're a user experience consultancy. We do a lot of kind of wireframing and site mapping and stuff, but we also do standards-based design. And also, I sort of author of this book called CSS Mastery, and also run a conference down in Brighton called Deconstruct. I've been kind of doing a bit of a US tour the last few days, and I've been speaking lots and lots. I've been going to lots of parties and shouting over the loud thumping music, so my voice is really taking a hammering. And I've just been speaking for like 2 hours solid next door, so if I'm sounding a bit croaky, I do apologise. I'll probably be taking numerous swigs of water as well. So thanks everyone for coming along. What I'm going to be doing today is just going to talk about a subject which I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with if you've done any CSS, which is the CSS world's favourite topic, which is bugs. But before talking about bugs, I want to really just discuss hacks, because the two kind of really coexist. Now, if there's one thing that's sure to ignite sort of discussion and argument amongst the web development community, and particularly the web standards community, it's the topic of hacks. Now, I'd just like to sort of get a quick show of hands. How many people feel they're using too many hacks at the moment in their code? Okay, that's interesting. How many people feel they're using too few? Wow, there's one or two people in the background. I'm not entirely sure if I believe them, though. Ideally we want to, be trying to remove the number of hacks we use. And the fact that you guys feel that you're using too many hacks, there was only like about sort of, maybe 15 or 20 hands up there, which is actually really good, because it kind of gives me with some confidence that the rest of you feel you've got it sussed. The rest of you have kind of ditched all these hacks and are just doing it the right way, which is fantastic. I want to talk a little bit about how I think we can minimize the number of hacks in our code, and you guys can see whether you're following some of the steps I outline. But before that, I just want to sort of talk about the terminology. The term hack in kind of sort of general computer sort of language refers to an inelegant and usually temporary solution to a problem. So you'll do something, you'll make a quick hack, and you do that because you maybe don't have time or you don't have the resources, but the assumption is that you'll always go back to it at some stage and make it better. So it's about shortcuts. It's about creating shortcuts in their code that there's a better way of doing it. The problem is with CSS, that's not what the term hack means, because most of the time there isn't another way of getting your website to work. So when we talk about CSS, they're not really hacks as such, because it's not like we're choosing to do something nasty and then we'll fix it later on. It really is because it's the only way we can get our sites to work. People often get really, really snooty when they come to discussing CSS hacks. I think part of the problem is the name. I think it has a very negative connotation. When you say something's a hacky thing, it's not necessarily a positive, comment. It's actually seen as quite derisory. So I much prefer using the term patch. I think the term patch is a much nicer term to use, because it really does define what we're doing here. We're not doing something that we're doing because we're bad developers and we're just doing something quickly. We're patching a buggy browser. And I think when you start using hacks, once you start thinking of them as patches, it makes it actually feel a little bit more justified. I'm not trying to give you reasons to start using lots and lots of hacks out there, but I just think that the term is quite negative. The term patch was actually coined by a very, very good developer called Dan Cederholm. And if you go and have a look at his website, he gives this whole reasoning about why he thinks patch is a much better term. Because it really just implies that there isn't a problem with your code, there's a problem with the browser. And I think this is really, really important. When something doesn't work in a browser, the natural assumption is to think that it's your fault. And clients will often blame the finger, saying, well, why doesn't this work? Why doesn't that work? And some of the time it's your fault. Actually, quite a lot of the time it's your fault. But And I'll get onto that in a second. But quite often it is the browser to blame. So why should we be made to feel bad? And why should we be made to feel that we're doing something wrong when we're being professional and we're using the only tools at our disposal to create the site and make it work as it should? So I think it's important to sort of take a bit of a step back and really understand what we're doing and why we're hacking. Another real common term to describe hacks is filters. It's a way of filtering out certain browsers from certain other browsers. So again, you'll use the term hack and filter often interchangeably. There is a slight difference, which I'll get onto in a second. But I think it's worth a bit of a history lesson. Again, if we're really, really snooty about hacks, the fact of the matter is we wouldn't all be sat in a conference today discussing CSS if it wasn't for hacks. The very first hack that was invented was called the box model hack. It was invented by a really, really smart local guy called Tantek Chelek, who at the time was working developing Microsoft Internet Explorer 5 on the Mac. And one of his friends, a guy called Jeffrey Zeldman, who's really well known as being one of the fathers of kind of modern CSS web development, kind of rang him up one day and said, "Look, Tantek, we're doing this new layout, and it works one way in IE5 for Mac, and it works another way in IE5 for Windows because of this problem with the box model. And how can we fix this? What can we do to get around it?" Tantek, being the smart guy he did, went and had a look at all the bugs that were featured in the various browsers and worked out a way of using these bugs to filter out different rules for different types of browsers. And so he created Tantek's box model hack, and that allowed, really for the first time, web developers to start developing websites that worked cross-browser and cross-platform. So it's really down to early hacks that made modern CSS development viable, because if it wasn't for that, CSS just wouldn't have taken off. So I think, first of all, we have to remember that we've got a lot to kind of thank in this kind of hacking arena, because otherwise we'd still be just doing table-based design. Now, we know that browsers are buggy. And when you start learning CSS, one of the first things you're told by any CSS pro is, yeah, browsers are buggy, browsers are buggy. So when people come across a bug, there's a natural tendency to immediately think it's a browser problem. And I see this time and time and again. I used to see people that come to IE5 and it was working in a certain way, and then they'd move on to Firefox and it was broken. And rather than thinking, oh, maybe I've done it wrong in IE, the assumption was, oh, it's a browser bug, it's a problem, it's an issue. So there is this kind of immediate knee-jerk reaction. And what I started seeing, in the early days of CSS, what happened was people would come onto mailing lists and say, oh, I've got a problem. This happens or that happens. In IE5, this is broken or that's broken. Over the last few years, people don't do that anymore. People go onto mailing lists and don't say, here's a code snippet, help me fix it. They say, well, I need a hack for Internet Explorer 5.5, version like Service Pack 2. Or I need a hack for Firefox, 0.901, whatever. People have lost the ability to try and look at what problems there are in their code and rely on hacks far too much, because they have this assumption, hacks exist, bugs, like browsers are buggy, hence I need to find a hack for a particular bug. And it's really bad and it's really damaging. Also, the flip side of that is you used to get a lot of CSS developers that wanted to show off, particularly on mailing lists. And so really, sort of 3 or 4 years ago, in the early days of CSS development, developers would go out of their way to find hacks. It was like the thing to do. You were nobody unless you found a hack. I mean, it's kind of really bizarre, but I've had people come up to me asking me what hacks I've developed, because that kind of seemed to be the sort of, the badge of achievement. If you've created a hack, you must be really, really good at CSS. It kind of, it kind of just, started polluting the waters. It really got to the stage where developers were measured not by their knowledge of the CSS spec or their ability to develop good layouts, but people started judging other developers on what hacks they knew. And I've seen so many times on mailing lists when someone will throw out this most obscure hack, not to be helpful, but just to prove to the community they're smarter, because they know the modified, simplified box model hack or whatever. It's kind of just using language to to kind of separate out the new people into the industry from the experts. And it's really, really not good. And you got to the situation where people started naming hacks like constellations, like star systems. People would get hacks named after them, like, you know, mountain peaks and stuff. And it started to get really, really ridiculous. So CSS became synonymous with hacks. So in this talk, what I'm going to discuss is how we can keep our hacks to a minimum. And then if we need to use hacks, how we can use them in a sensible way. So, bug fixing. Oh, by the way, I spent a lot of time researching these slides, researching pictures of bugs on the internet. And when I was kind of putting my slides together, after about half an hour, I started getting all itchy. It's really, really weird sitting in front of this deck watching all these kind of bugs and stuff. So if any of you guys are squeamish, I do apologize. But yeah, got some really crazy pictures on this slide. Okay, so browsers are buggy. But not as buggy as we'd like to think. Some browsers don't support the full CSS specification. In fact, very few do. They miss out key features like minimum width. It's only really recently that browsers like IE7 have started supporting more of the CSS2 spec. Other browsers have rendering bugs. Again, IE5 and IE6 are culprits here. And this can make complicated, like, layout really, really complicated. And even when browsers aren't technically buggy, they have sort of inconsistent rendering. One of the issues with the CSS spec is it explains to browser vendors how CSS works, but it doesn't lay down definite guidelines for things like padding and margins. So every browser will have different default paddings and margins. Internet Explorer has different default font sizes and line heights. So even if you get to a stage where all browsers are supporting equal, you're still going to get rendering differences. You're still going to get sites that look slightly different on one browser to another. So I'm sure we've all sat around and we've cursed IE5, you know, at some stage in our development career. I know, like, you know, pretty much every day I just kind of bite my tongue when IE5 or IE6 is doing something really, really stupid. But while it's true that Internet Explorer 5 and 6 probably have more bugs than most, it's not alone. You know, there are lots of other browsers out there that do have lots of bugs, but still browsers aren't buggy as we'd like to think. Now, most CSS developers I know are self-taught. We've gone on mailing lists, we've gone to other web designers' sites and deconstructed their code and looked at their comment and see how it works. Very few people have had formal training. Even few of us have kind of bothered to read the CSS specification because, frankly, it's a bit of a minefield. It's not very human readable because it was designed for browser manufacturers and rocket scientists, obviously not normal human beings. So a lot of people are put off by the CSS spec. A lot of people don't read the CSS spec. So a lot of people just pick things up. They do something, it appears to work, they appear to understand why it works, and that becomes part of their knowledge base. The problem is CSS appears to be a simple language, and on the surface it is quite simple. But it belies a lot of complexity underneath. In the session I did, the last two sessions, we talked a lot about the kind of quirks of CSS, about things like margin collapsing, which is very, very confusing. The layout and floating and positioning models of CSS. On the surface it all seems easy, but once you start kind of scratching away at that surface, the complexity starts to get really, really big. So when people start doing things like floating and clearing, and it behaves in a way that they don't expect, the automatic reaction is to say, this must be a bug with a browser. Sadly, 9 times out of 10, it's not a bug with a browser. It's literally not understanding what the problem is. So, bugs come from a lot of different places. They come from syntax errors, missing off a semicolon, even kind of spelling class names incorrectly. I see that happening quite a lot. People type in the wrong class name and then wonder why it's not working. You know, syntax errors are really, really common. And this is one reason why we should all validate our code. A slightly more complicated problem is specificity clashes. Now, how many of you people have heard of specificity? How many of you understand how it works? Okay, so slightly less. Specificity is really, really confusing. I'm not going to go into the details now, but basically it's if an element has 3 or 4 different styles, like a colour associated with it, specificity is the way that the browser decides which of those styles wins. And it's based on how specific the style is, how specific the selector is. So if you have a really unspecific selector like P for paragraph, it will always lose out to a more specific selector like ID or class name or paragraph.class name. So specificity is one of those problems that comes up quite a lot. And you know that it's a specificity problem usually when you're trying to add a style to something. You're trying to make something a particular colour. And you go and check in the browser and it's just not taking. And you go back and you try something else and it's not taking. It's usually because you're applying a more specific selector to that element in some other part of your style sheet. So specificity is a big problem, and it's one that a lot of people have. I think one of the biggest problems is overcomplicated code. Now, we like to be really, really clever. And if there's a simple option and a difficult option, we always tend to go down the difficult option as a route. I don't understand this. It's just human nature, but we just make lives harder for ourselves. And so many times I've tried to do this really difficult, complicated CSS layout, and it doesn't work in Opera 5 or Opera 7 or this browser or that browser, and you add complexity and you add complexity and it gets even worse. And when you strip that complexity away, it actually works. Because the more complexity you add in, the more likely it is the browser's going to choke. So overcomplicated code is really, really a big problem. And then, of course, there are browser bugs. And I put them in this order because I really honestly think that this is the order that we're dealing with here. Browser bugs are not the first thing that you deal with. Usually they're the last thing. Usually it's human error. Usually it's syntax error. Usually it's not understanding how CSS works fully, or it's a specificity clash, or it's just overly complicated code. Browser bugs are a lot less common than you'd think. I think this is the #1 cause of bugs, though. It's an incomplete understanding of the spec. So I've put together a bunch of laws, my laws of bug fixing. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'll explain to you what my laws of bug fixing are. If you kind of read the average CSS forum, you assume that sites are riddled with bugs. However, when I'm building sites, I usually don't come across that many. I'm really, if I come across 2 or 3 bugs in an averagely complicated site, that's normal. 5 or 6 bugs, that's sort of starting to get unusual. So if you're coming across more than sort of half a dozen bugs, you're doing something wrong. And you're probably overly complicating your code. So you really need to keep it simple. The simpler your code, the less it can go wrong. For instance, I remember this situation where, this is a few years ago, I was following this kind of online tutorial about laying out a form. And to do the laying out the form, you had to wrap the form elements, like the inputs in a div and the labels in another div, and you'd float one left and you'd float one right, and you'd add a clearing element, and it was really, really complicated. The code was actually much more complicated than just using a table. And it would work in IE, but then I'd notice it was broken in Opera. So I'd go into Opera and I'd add more code to fix the problem. Then I'd flick back to Safari and it had broken. So I'd add more code to fix it in Safari, then I'd flick back to Opera and it had broken. Then I'd fix Opera and I'd flick back to IE. And each time I experienced a bug, I kept on adding more and more and more and more code. And each time I added more code, it added more complexity, and more things started to break. And the whole thing started to fall to bits. I spent probably about well over a day, possibly close to 2 days, just trying to get this really simple form layout, or what should be a simple form layout to work. And I was just having none of it, and I was getting really, really frustrated. So as a last kind of attempt, I thought, okay, I'm going to start again from scratch. Took all of the extraneous code out, made it as simple as possible. What do you know? It worked first time. What took me almost 2 days to fix, I could have done right from the start by doing it as simple as humanly possible, and it worked across all the browsers. So keeping your code simple, it works. It really does. My second law of bug fixing. Always assume it's your fault. When you come across a layout bug, rather than just knee-jerk reaction thinking, oh, it must be a browser bug, let me go and get a hack, and immediately reaching for your, my big book of hacks, my first book of hacks or whatever, check your code. Make sure you haven't introduced any bugs yourself. Make sure what you think you're trying to achieve through your code is what you're actually going to achieve. Understand the CSS and make sure you're sure that it's not just a problem, misunderstanding. Make sure that you don't have any specificity clashes. Test your code in a standard compliant browser. I mean, we should all be doing this. We all should be testing in standard compliant browser before we move on to things like IE. Only once you're absolutely sure that what you're doing is the right thing, then you should assume it's the fault of the browser. This is the right way of approaching any problem. Assume it's your fault, try and fix the problem, and if, as a last resort, you can't, or if as a last resort you really decide it must be a browser problem, then assume it's a browser problem, but always think it's your fault. You never go wrong if you think it's your fault always. So my third law, prevention is better than cure. There's almost always more than one way to achieve a specific layout. I mean, if we look at 2-3 column layouts, there's hundreds of different ways of doing 2-3 column layouts. If you want to lay out a form, then there's dozens of ways of laying out forms. Round the corner boxes, there's more round the corner boxes than letters in the alphabet. CSS has this proliferation of different ways of doing things. So rather than being stuck on a specific method, rather than spending a whole day trying to get this specific method to work, if it's not working for you, try a different method. One of the things that I tend to do, or one of the things people talk about a lot, is the box model problem. So what this problem is something that IE has. It's a fundamental problem with Internet Explorer's rendering engine. And it gets the box model wrong. It gets the CSS box model wrong. And the way it does this is if you specify width and padding, or width and border. So as I said in the talk next door earlier on, rather than kind of fighting against it, and rather than throwing hacks at the problem, just remove the instances of the problem, remove the thing that causes a problem in the first case. Try not to put a border or a padding on elements that you know you're given a fixed width to. You can give padding or margins to the parent, or padding or margin to the child. Just avoid giving the padding or the padding or the border to the element that you've given width to. And this works 9 out of 10 times because you're skirting around the issue. If you know something's going to cause a problem, don't do it. And if you learn more about the bugs out there and the fixes, you can kind of avoid these problems in the first part. Again, if something's causing a problem, if something's breaking a design, you could always choose to change the design. We're living in a very, very flexible world, and particularly working in a flexible world on the web. If something is really, really causing problems, and it's going to break in this browser or that browser, it makes much more sense just to be pragmatic, go back to the designer, go back to the client, go back to the project manager and say, look, this effect that your designer has created is going to cause lots of problems. It's going to take an extra 2 or 3 days to build. It still might break in old browsers. Can we just go back and can we tweak the design slightly? And I know for a lot of people that's scary. It's really scary to go back to a client and say, we need to change the design. But you have to in some situations. And it makes much more sense to work around the medium rather than against it. So go with the flow instead of against it. Otherwise you just spend the whole time banging your head against a brick wall when you don't have to. My next law is offense is often the best form of defense. Get to know your enemies, get to know the common bugs, and get to know their fixes. There's a lot of bugs out there that are really well documented. A lot of them documented for IE not because IE is the most buggy browser in the world, although it is pretty damn buggy, but because it's the most common. And because it's the most common browser in the world, people bubble up bugs a lot easier. Not that many people use Opera, so not as many people use Opera anyway. So it's a lot more difficult to find fixes to bugs in Opera. IE, 60% probably at the moment. 4 or 5 years ago, it's probably close to 90% of people used IE. These bugs, when they get found quickly, they get fixed quickly. So no common bugs and no common fixes. For instance, there's a really common bug called the IE double margin float bug. And what happens if you float an element in IE that has a margin applied to it, IE very handily doubles the margin. So if you give a 10 pixel margin, it will give you a 20 pixel margin. It's really infuriating. If you don't know this bug, it's a cause of lots of dropped float layouts. It's really, really irritating. But if you know that this bug exists, there's a really common fix. The common fix is to apply display inline. If you apply display inline to any element that's floated and has a margin, it just fixes it in IE. There's a reason why, and I'll get onto that into a second, but if you know the common fixes, you don't even have to wait for the bug to surface itself. You see the patterns. You're there coding away, and you go, float left, margin right, 10 pixels. Okay, I just need to stick in display inline. That will fix it. You don't even have to worry about it. So get into the habit of applying common fixes before they even become problems. The reason IE 5 and 6, and to a certain extent 7, is so buggy is their rendering model, their kind of rendering engine, below the hood. They have this internal property called layout. It's not a CSS property. It's not really a JavaScript property, although you can read it using the DOM. You can do has layout, and it tells you whether this property layout is on or off on an element. But this property is really it is really a hack in the true sense of the word. What IE found, or the IE team found, is it was really, really complicated for the rendering engine to lay the pages out. So they thought, okay, well, a really easy way of doing this, rather than checking every single element on the page and kind of laying it out, we'd just give a flag to elements that we think should be laid out. And the property was called layout. And so anything that they think needs to be handled differently, rather than checking every element, it only really checks elements that have been given the special property called layout. But this causes a lot of problems because it doesn't quite get it right. So quite often, the way to fix problems in IE is to give IE layout. And you can give IE layout by lots of different ways. Giving it a display inline is one way to give the element layout. Giving it a specific width or height or dimension is another way to give it layout. And I'll show you some examples of this process happening. You don't really need to understand what layout is or the mechanisms, but there are some really good examples and really good articles online. So if you really are scratching your hair and pulling your hair out and wondering why is IE 5 and 6 doing it this way, it's because layout, and you can go in and actually find out why it's behaving this way. But it's really weird, really complicated, and it's really just a nasty hack that they did to make the rendering speeds faster. So my fifth law of bug fixing: isolate the problem. So we've got to a situation where, we're fairly sure that it's a browser bug. Now, browser bugs often stem from complications. If you've only got one or two things affecting an element, there's not much complexity. If you've got 5, 6, 7, 8 styles affecting an element, the complexity increases tenfold. So the best way to do bug fixing is to isolate the problem. So go into your style sheets or go into XHTML, remove all the HTML that appears before the bug, save it, check, does a bug exist? Yeah, it's still there. Remove all the HTML after the bug, check it, yes, it's still there. And then you've boiled down the HTML. Then start stripping out IDs and classes and tags. And keep going and keep going and keep going until you've got the crux of the problem. And what you'll usually find is something that was really, really complicated and you didn't know where to start can now be replicated in maybe 2 or 3 lines of HTML. Then go in your CSS and do the same thing. Comment out your color style sheet. Is the bug still there? Yes. That's not the problem. Ditch it. Your typography style sheet. Is the bug there? Yes. Ditch it. Then go into your layout style sheet and again start copying and pasting or cutting and pasting or commenting out various chunks and just keep boiling it down and boiling it down and boiling it down. And what you'll end up with is you'll end up with a test case. You'll end up with a minimal test case that has 4 or 5 lines of HTML, 2 or 3 lines of CSS, and then you can start looking at the problem. And then you can start trying to alter the test case to see how you can fix it. Change a few properties or values, delete a value, and if that value that you've deleted stops a bug from happening, you know that value is responsible. Because the whole point of what you're trying to do is you're trying to get a methodology, you're trying to have an approach to bug fixing. And the way you do that is by trying to isolate the problem, trying to figure out which of the 2 or 3 elements in this massive list of CSS is causing the issue. And my 6th law of bug fixing, and final one, only hack as a last resort. So if you've gone through this process, if you've checked that you're doing it right, if you've created a minimal test case, You've posted it up online, you've asked for help from the community, you still can't get this problem solved, then turn to hacks. But it really is a last case, not a first case. They're powerful tools, and you don't want to use your most powerful tool until you really need to. So how do we use hacks sensibly? Well, there's a few different kinds of hacks, and I'm going to describe the different kinds of hacks for you now. Tantek Celik, who invented the first hack, wrote a really good article called Pandora's Box Model of CSS Hacks. I definitely advise you to go and have a read of this, because it's really, really interesting. First of all, he explains that hacks that rely on unsupported CSS aren't really hacks at all. They're actually the correct way to do CSS. So you see a lot of people saying, oh, well, the attribute selector. If you use the attribute selector to target an ID, that's a CSS hack. Well, it's not, because the attribute selector is supposed to target IDs. So using the CSS attribute selector to filter off some styles to more compliant browsers and some styles to less compliant browsers isn't a hack. That's the way CSS was designed. It's perfectly valid. And you see this being used in things like applying PNG transparency. Back in the old days, before you used to apply PNG transparency by using the IE filter mechanism, which I described earlier on today in the room next door, what people used to do is they used to say, well, look, I'll give all good browsers the PNG with transparency, and then give IE and all old browsers just a GIF. And the way they used to do that is used to say, well, ID, using the attribute selector, apply the PNG to this element, and then any other browser just override it with a GIF. And that's perfectly valid, because you're using the benefits of CSS. The real kind of sort of hacky things are hacks that rely on parsing bugs. This is a proper hack. A parsing bug basically is a programmatic problem. Your parser, your browser, will look at the CSS and it will get confused by certain characters. So when you look at something like Tantek's box model hack, you'll see lots of backslashes and quotation marks. What's happening there is the browser is looking at this CSS and starts to get really confused, because it doesn't know how to handle all these backslashes and quote marks and stuff, and ignores a certain part of the rule. So that's how a lot of hacks work. Then you've got, like I described before, things that rely on unsupported CSS. Now, there are a lot of hacks out there. And if you have to use a hack, I'd consider these rules. Use a hack that's valid. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have code in your CSS files that are invalid. If you run something through the validation and it says, uh-oh, no, this is wrong, this is broken, it's a bad hack. So only use valid CSS. Only target older browsers. It's really, really dangerous if you start to target current browsers. So, if it's broken in IE 5.2, use a hack to fix it in IE 5.2 on Mac. If it's broken in an old form of Opera, like Opera 5 or Opera 6, and you really care about Opera, use a hack to fix Opera. What you don't want to be doing is you don't want to be using hacks to fix IE7. That's really, really bad. If you're finding that you're trying to find a hack for IE7 or Firefox, what are we on now, 1.2 or... Oh, 2, yes, good point. 3 is coming out soon as well, which I'm quite excited about. If you're using hacks for modern browsers, you're doing it wrong, because you should be designing and doing style sheets for modern browsers. And Tantek's last kind of rule is hacks should be ugly. I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but his philosophy is, if you're going through a whole bunch of style sheets and you see this horrible thing that's got backslashes and stars and quote marks, you know it's a hack. It kind of, it's setting itself up, and you can scroll through and delete it if you want. I'm not sure I definitely agree with that, but it kind of makes a certain amount of sense. I do apologise, I don't know where that came from. So, there's a couple of different hacks you can use. My preference is not to use them, or to use them sparingly. If you need to use hacks, only use a small number in your main CSS file. If you start to need more hacks, then you want to start filtering them off. You want to put most of your hacks in a separate CSS file. and you should always comment your hacks. So my preference for hacks, Tantec Celic has got a series of hacks called the band pass filter. And what these do is they target particular types of browser. They target IE5, IE5.5, IE6, and they're a really, really good way of actually bringing in a separate style sheet. So what they do is they filter out the style sheet. So they say, if you're IE5, here's a style sheet specially for you. And then in IE5 or IE5.5, you can go in and put your code in that is targeted only for that browser. Again, that works with IE6 and IE5.2 on Mac, I believe. There's also something called conditional comments. Now, conditional comments are an Internet Explorer only tool. They live in the head of your document usually, and they're basically comments on steroids. They're comments that you can put logic in. So you can go in and you can say in this comment, okay, I only want to bring in styles for IE5 or only styles for IE5.5. This is what the IE7 team have been suggesting. They've been really, really pushing conditional comments. The problem that I have with conditional comments is you have to put these in the head of every page of your document. So if you then have to go in and delete that at some stage, you have to go in and delete it on every single page. Now, if you're doing sort of, modular back-end programming and you'll have headers and footers, that's not a big problem. But even so, it's a bit of a hassle. If you use Tantec's bandpass filters, what you do is you have like your basic CSS file, and then in that CSS file you can bring in a CSS file purely for each different browser. And it's so much better because what happens then is if at some stage you decide to stop supporting a particular browser, say you've decided in your company that we're no longer supporting IE5, you can just go into a single style sheet, delete that command to bring in those hacks, and you've basically just deleted it out of your whole system, rather than having to go through and delete individual CSS declarations. So really the best way of doing it is to kind of try and isolate all your CSS-specific hacks into separate style sheets. So, do we have any questions about hacking? Oh, lots and lots of questions. I'll start at the front. Can we have this lady here? Okay. Yes, the question was, where can we find common fixes? There's a website called Centrical, which is very, very good, which has a list of all of the kind of CSS hacks. I'll try. I think it's CENTRICLE, Centrical. That sounds about right. I'm not sure. If you do a search and it's spelt wrong in Google, it will very, very kindly, check your spelling, which I use quite a lot. Centrical. Also, there's... let me just have a look here. This book, by the way, is very good. It's got a whole... sorry. I should have said that, shouldn't I? The book in here has got a whole chapter, or two chapters in the back. One about responsible hacking and one about common hacks. But there's lots of common hacks out there and lots of common bugs, like the 3-pixel text jog bug in IE, the peekaboo bug in IE, like I said, the float doubling bug in IE. The thing to do really is, when you find a problem, when you find a CSS problem, usually you can work out what the symptoms are. So if you've noticed that in IE, when you're floating an element, the margin is doubled, go to Google, because Google's your savior, and say IE CSS double margin float bug, and then you'll get hundreds and hundreds of responses back. So there are lots and lots of resources out there. The problem is that they're all quite disparate, so it's probably worth looking at the symptoms and then doing a search. But like I say, the book does have a section of like the sort of the 10 sort of most common bugs. So again, it's probably worth having a flick through that. Any more questions at the front there?
You talked about offense being a good defense.
Yes.
Are there any particular things that you do in all of your pages ahead of time?
Well, it's like I said, there's this thing called layout in Internet Explorer, and the way of triggering layout, you can trigger it by a number of ways. Like I say, one is by setting a display property to something like inline. Another way is by setting a width or a height, like a unit. So you'll see a lot of CSS bugs CSS hacks that target Internet Explorer, say, you'll see a whole bunch of stars and then height equals 0. The reason they're doing height equals 0 is not to kind of make the height 0, because it's because putting height equals 0 triggers this layout function. And so quite often when I get a problem, I see a problem appear, I'll just throw in display inline or height equals 0 or height equals 100% and see if that works. And that often fixes things. So that's kind of more the offense, best form of defense. I think it's just the keeping the code simple. The simpler the code is, the less likelihood that bugs are going to appear. Gentleman at the front. I'm a Mac user, so I don't use TopStyle. I use a mixture of something called skEdit on Mac, which is a nice little editor. A lot of my colleagues also use TextMate, which is quite it's very, very trendy amongst web developers, back-end developers, because it's got syntax checking for Ruby and PHP and all these kind of things, and it does XHTML and CSS as well. A lot of the more kind of hardcore, old-school people just use BBEdit. But I quite like skEdit because it's got syntax highlighting, it's got code completion. So if you start typing font hyphen, it gives you like 3 or 4 options. Do you want font face? Do you want font family? Or whatever. So that's really, really neat. It doesn't really help so much in bug fixing. Things that I find really help in bug fixing are just applying borders around an image or borders around an element, because it just kind of lets you see how things are lining up. A really good tool is the Web Developer Toolbar for Firefox. So if you're not using that at the moment, you should really go to the Mozilla website, download the Firefox Web Developer Toolbar, and it gives you a lot of different tools for bug fixing. There's also a really nice tool which I talked about next door called Xyloscope, which is, again, it's a Mac-based tool, but it allows you to kind of almost traverse the DOM. So you can go and see what styles have been applied to a particular element. So you click on that element and it says, you're getting these styles from here, these styles from there, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility in trying to figure out where your styles are coming from and where the problems are coming from. And a lot of it is just trial and error. Change a couple of values, go back to the browser, see if that's affected the problem, and then come back again. But yeah, I think we are, Dreamweaver is a pretty good tool still. I don't use it I personally don't use it, but the kind of text editing in there is quite nice. It's got some quite nice kind of site maintenance stuff. TopStyle Pro, like I said. WestCiv, another company that have got a really nice product out there called StyleMaster. So there are products out there that are good, but a lot of people just default to the humble text editor. Any more questions further at the back? You've had a lot, so I'm going to ask somebody else. Over there. Could you say that again? Oh, well, mobile is a whole different kettle of fish. The question was, where can we find hacks for mobile browsers? Developing CSS-based sites for mobile content is very, very different. It's not something I've got a lot of experience in. If you go to, there's a company called Blue Flavor, and they've got a guy there called Brian Fling who's really, really up on the whole CSS for mobile development. If you ever get a chance to see Brian speak at a conference or go and see his blog, do a search for Brian Fling. He's got a lot of information on there, and he'd probably be the person to speak to. There's another developer called Cameron Moll, who's also very experienced with mobile web development, and they might have some information on that. I think the problem is there's so few people developing for mobile platforms that the number of bugs and browsers and hacks being reported and developed is a lot smaller. So I really don't know if there's much information out there about bugs on mobile, I'm afraid. Over there. Okay.
Is there any one place you can go that will show you the site in almost?
Okay, the question is about browser versions. I think that's a really, really good question. There's a couple of services online that allow you to test your websites in multiple browsers. BrowserCam is one of them. BrowserCam is a nice little application where you go in, you put in a URL, and then it will test it on maybe 20 or 30 different browsers. There's also another application called SiteVista that does the same. I think it has slightly less browsers, but it's still quite a good sort of complement of browsers. really like my Mac because I use this thing called Parallels, which basically is emulation software. So I have various versions of Windows running on this machine as well as Mac. So I can test on this machine in Safari, in Opera, in Firefox on my Mac. Then I can switch into Parallels and I can test on Windows 95 and test on Windows 2000 and test on Windows XP. If you go to evolt.org, there's the Evolt Browser Archive. And they have an archive of every single browser that's ever been released. So you can go down and get a download of IE 5.2 on Mac, or IE... sorry, yes?
What would you say, I couldn't understand what you were.
Parallels, sorry, yes, my accent. There's a web application on the Mac called Parallels, as in next to each other. And it's really nice, and it allows you to run various Windows applications or various versions of Windows on your Mac. So this is a really nice little test suite, because you can test on Windows, you can run, because otherwise if you've got it in your office, you need to have 3 or 4 different machines that are running different versions of, Windows. So having this emulation software is really good. I mean, I think you can do it. I think there's things like VMware and stuff. I'm not really part of the Windows crowd, but I think VMware allows you to have some of that similar ability on a PC. But that's a really, really good tool. So that's the question about kind of testing and where you can go to test, BrowserCam, Site Vista. Regarding the other part of the question was, what was the other part of the question again? Versions, yes, that's right. This is a really, really common question. What version should I test on, or what version should I test on? To a certain extent, it's down to you and your business needs. So look at your users, look at who's coming to your website and the websites you're designing for your clients if you're doing client work, and see. If you've got a high percentage of people coming to your website still using IE4 or IE5, you might have to develop for IE4 or IE5. If you're in the publishing world and you still have a lot of users that are using OS 9, IE 5.2 on Mac, then you might have to develop for IE 5.2 on Mac. As a general rule, personally, if that information isn't available, or if we look at the information, there's just not that many people using those browsers, I tend to set IE6 as a baseline. Now that IE7 is out, IE7 take-up has been quite fast. IE6, again, tends to have a pretty good take-up. So I tend to develop primarily for IE6 for the latest versions of Firefox, Safari, and Opera. I tend not to worry about older versions like 1.2 or whatever. But the good thing about things like Safari, well, there's a good and a bad thing. The good thing about things Safari and Firefox is they've always been fairly stable. So the bugs that they find are usually quite minor. The problem is there's like 100 different variations out there, and you can't develop for every single variation. So you do need to have a bit of a baseline. You need to say, well, we'll support we support Firefox 1.2 and 2.0, but nothing else. If you look at, did anyone go to see Nate Checkley's talk earlier today, before lunch? Nate works for Yahoo. He works for the YUI team in Yahoo. And they have some really, really good resources on their website. And one of their resources is what they call the graded browser chart. And this is how Yahoo work. They have this kind of matrix, and they have like 3 levels of support. They have like the premium level of support, which is going to be like your IE7s and your Firefoxes, your latest browsers. And they say these browsers will always get the best version of our website possible. Then they have a next tier down, and they say, well, these browsers, we'll try to support them as much as possible, but there might be slight display errors, and we're fine with that. And then they have another level down, which is, well, we're not even getting involved in these browsers. These browsers are dead to us, Really, really old browsers like IE3 or whatever. It's just like, no, we're not even touching these. If they break, they break. And so it doesn't have to be an either or. You can have graded support. The BBC do a very similar thing with their website. They have this graded support chart, And at the very least, if you want, what you can do is you can use CSS to hide styles from older browsers. So you can say, well, version 4 browsers, we don't really care about them getting the design, but we can just display the content. So you can say, well, for version 4 browsers, we're not going to show them any CSS. And that way, at least they get access to the content. They get a fairly ugly, unstyled page. But really, if they're on version 4 browsers, they should have updated by now. And it's an easy thing for me to say, but Microsoft don't support IE5 anymore. I don't even know if they support IE6, but they stopped supporting IE5 well over a year ago. And my feeling is, to a certain extent, if Microsoft, the developers of this software, have stopped supporting it, it's kind of getting to about time that we stop supporting it as well. And the more we stop supporting older browsers like that, the more people will be encouraged to upgrade to new browsers. Some people are stuck. Some people have got very, very slow IT teams. And what happens is they'll have decided that IE5 is safe 8 years ago, and then never let anyone upgrade, which is just absolutely ridiculous, because if you're stuck on IE5 now, you've basically, you're letting the hackers in, opening the door and say, hey, steal all our stuff. So it's a really, really backwards approach, but a lot of companies do suffer that problem. And the thing to do is, if you are working with companies like that, try and badger their IT team and say, look, you can't be having this policy of IE5 on all these machines, you need to upgrade. Brilliant. Any more questions? Okay, this gentleman over here.
What about testing through email clients like
The question was about email clients. My answer to that is I don't do any email stuff because it's such a pain in the arse. If you think like the 5 or 6 browsers we have to contend with on the web is difficult enough, then you throw in like the 20 or so email clients, software email clients, then you throw in things like Hotmail and web-based clients, because you would have thought web-based clients would make it easier, but they don't. Because web-based clients quite often use CSS to do their layout anyway, they will deliberately strip out CSS from emails because it clashes, and you get this whole namespacing issue. So quite often, you would think that websites would render CSS emails better, but they actually just don't render them at all, or strip out all the CSS. Being a traditional, web geek type person, I really dislike CSS or HTML emails in general. I would much prefer to receive plain text, because I think that's what email was designed for. I think email was designed for plain text. From a marketing perspective, I do appreciate that it has been proven that nicely designed HTML emails can provide a slightly better return on investment in the short term. I don't know about the long term, but I know that what happens is a lot of people like me will turn off HTML-based emails and will never get any of this stuff anyway. It always tends up to get flagged up in spam by spam filters, so I think you've got a much better chance of getting through the corporate firewall if you don't send CSS or styled emails. The only time I've ever seen a really nicely styled email was from a conference I signed up to recently, and they sent their receipt in a nice styled format, and it was easier to read. But most of the time I think it's bad. Really, really difficult to deal with. So as a company, it's not something we tend to get involved with, because there's so much pain for little pleasure. But I do feel bad for people that have to do CSS-based emails. I really feel for you. Maybe there's an opportunity to write a book about doing email with CSS. I don't know. Anyway, I think we'll call that a day for now. So thank you very much for coming. If you have any questions, you can email me at andy@clearleft.com. And if you want to grab these slides, I did have the URL on my last talk, but I don't have it now. So let me just bring up the URL for the slides. Yep. The slides can be downloaded from andybud.com, WDWSF07 if you want to get a copy of the slides.